Welcome to the conversation. Today, we are opening up the record on what is, without a doubt, one of the most legally complex and publicly debated homicide cases in recent memory.
We are going to be looking at the murder of Hae Min Lee and the legal journey of Adnan Syed that has spanned more than a quarter century now.
Our focus here is really an impartial, structured exploration of the sources we have. We're aiming to track the critical facts and the major legal turning points.
Right. From conviction to having that conviction vacated and then back to reinstatement. We're sticking strictly to what the court records and investigative summaries tell us.
And before we get into any of the legal specifics, it's absolutely essential that we start by honoring the victim here, Hae Min Lee. She was a Korean-American high school student, just 18 years old, in a magnet program at Woodlawn High School in Baltimore County.
A dedicated athlete, too.
Yeah.
She played lacrosse and field hockey.
Exactly, and her life was it was tragically cut short, and we really have to acknowledge the permanent, profound impact this had on her family. Her mother, young Kim, her brother, young Lee. Their lives were forever changed by this.
Establishing the initial timeline is so crucial to understanding how the investigation took shape. Hae Min Lee was last seen on January 13th, 1999. This was in the afternoon, right after school.
Right, around 2:15 p.m., and the alarm was raised almost immediately because she had a very important, very routine task that she failed to do.
She was supposed to pick up her younger cousin from daycare that afternoon. And when she didn't show up, that's when everyone knew something was wrong.
And what started as a search very quickly turned into a homicide investigation. On February 9th, 1999, so nearly a month later.
Yeah, a month goes by.
Her body was discovered partially buried in Leakin Park in Baltimore.
And the medical examiner determined the cause of death was manual strangulation.
The police investigation, from there, it seemed to narrow incredibly fast.
It did. Just 3 days after her body was found, on February 12th, the Baltimore City Homicide Division gets an anonymous phone call. And that call tells them to focus their attention on her ex-boyfriend, Adnan Syed.
And it's interesting to note that the police had actually already talked to Adnan on the very day she went missing.
Around 6:30 p.m. that evening, yes, as part of the initial missing persons inquiry. But this anonymous tip that really sharpened their focus.
So following that tip and interviews with friends, Adnan Syed was arrested on February 28th, 1999, about 6 weeks after Hae Min Lee disappeared.
And that initial, very swift investigation really sets the stage for this long legal journey. So let's start with the foundation of the case the state built back in 1999 and 2000.
Okay, so Syed is charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, false imprisonment, and robbery.
Right. And from the very beginning, the prosecution had a problem. They had no definitive physical evidence, no DNA, no fingerprints linking Syed to the crime scene.
So their entire case had to be built on something else.
It was built on two things, really. The first was cell phone records, which they used to try and establish location. And the second, and arguably the most important, was the testimony of a single person.
His friend, Jay Wilds.
Exactly, Jay Wilds.
And Jay's role in this is absolutely central to the original conviction. He wasn't just a witness, he admitted he was an accessory.
Yes, an accessory after the fact.
Yeah.
His story was that Adnan confessed him, showed him Hae Min's body, and that he, Jay, then helped Adnan bury her body in Leakin Park.
So his testimony provided the entire narrative for the state. The timeline, the confession, the burial, everything.
It was the backbone of their case. But there's a critical legal component here that would come under intense scrutiny years later.
The plea deal.
The plea deal. In exchange for his testimony against Adnan, Jay Wilds was given a 5-year suspended sentence and 2 years of probation.
Which means he served no jail time for being an accessory to a murder.
None. And you have to understand, the state relied almost completely on his account. An account which, it's fair to say, included details that changed over time, that were inconsistent in his various interviews with the police.
So the defense's job in that first trial was to discredit this star witness who had a very clear reason to cooperate with the prosecution.
It's a huge challenge. But before they could even fully present the evidence, the whole process it came to a screeching halt.
Right. The first trial in December 1999. It didn't even finish.
No, it ended in a mistrial. And the reason is just, it's pretty unprecedented.
It was because of the defense attorney, Christina Gutierrez.
It was. She got into a very public, very heated argument with the judge during a sidebar conversation.
And the jurors could hear it.
That's the key. She accused the judge of lying, and she did it within earshot of the jury. That's a fundamental breach of procedure.
It completely compromises their impartiality.
Instantly. The judge had no choice but to declare a mistrial. They had to start all over again.
Which just speaks to the kind of tension and the high-stakes atmosphere around this case from the very beginning.
Absolutely. So the second trial starts in January of 2000,
Mhm.
and this one goes on for 6 weeks.
And on February 25th, 2000, the jury comes back.
They find Syed guilty on all 4 counts.
Mhm.
The combination of Jay Wilde's very detailed, though, shifting testimony and that new cell phone location data,
Mhm.
it was enough.
Adnan Syed was then sentenced to life in prison, plus an additional 30 years.
And his family's reaction really tells you how they felt about his legal representation at that point.
They fired Cristina Gutierrez immediately.
Immediately. Syed's direct appeals after that were all unsuccessful, and for all intents and purposes, the conviction seemed final. He was going to spend the rest of his life in prison.
For more than a decade, the case was, legally stable, not totally forgotten, but settled. But then in 2014, the entire thing was just resurrected. It was put under this incredible international spotlight.
And this wasn't driven by a new legal filing, which is what's so interesting. It was driven by investigative journalism.
The influence of the 2014 podcast serial is impossible to overstate here. It went through the murder, the investigation, the trial.
And it just exploded. I mean, the numbers in our sources are staggering. By June 2016, it had more than 100 million downloads.
It fundamentally changed the entire context of the case. It went from being a closed and shut conviction to a very active, very public investigation.
And that created a kind of cascade effect.
Yeah.
That initial burst of interest led to other, more specialized follow-ups.
Right. You had the undisclosed podcast, which was led by attorneys who were just relentlessly scrutinizing the state's case.
You had TV specials, like the one on investigation discovery, books being published by people involved. It created this sustained environment of pressure and resources to re-examine evidence the courts had considered settled for years.
And while all this public attention was exploding in 2014, the legal wheels had actually started turning a bit earlier.
That's a really important point. Syed filed what's called a post-conviction relief petition back in May of 2010.
And the core legal argument was based on the Sixth Amendment.
Ineffective assistance of counsel. Specifically, he argued that Cristina Gutierrez had failed to investigate a potentially crucial alibi witness.
And this is where the name Asia McClain becomes central to the whole story.
Absolutely. This is the heart of the post-conviction appeals. Asia McClain provided a sworn affidavit saying she was with Adnan Syed in the Woodlawn High School library at the exact time prosecutors said he was miles away attacking Hae Min Lee in a Best Buy parking lot.
If that's true, and if a jury had heard that, it would have completely shattered the state's timeline.
It would have undermined the entire factual premise of their case.
But initially, that argument, it didn't work. In January 2014, a judge rejected the petition.
Right, Judge Martin Walsh dismissed it. And his reasoning gets into some pretty specific legal standards.
The Strickland standard.
The Strickland standard, from a Supreme Court case, Strickland v. Washington. And it sets up a 2-part test for ineffective counsel.
First, you have to prove the lawyer's performance was deficient, that it fell below a reasonable standard.
And second, you have to prove that this deficiency actually resulted in prejudice, meaning there's a reasonable probability that if the lawyer hadn't made the error, the outcome of the trial would have been different.
And that second part, the prejudice part, that's a really high bar to clear.
Extremely high. And Judge Welch initially found that Gutierrez not calling Asia McClain was a strategic decision, not incompetence.
Why strategic?
Because there were some perceived inconsistencies between McClain's timeline and what Adnan himself remembered about that day. The thinking was that Gutierrez saw that as a risk. And if it's a strategic choice, it doesn't meet that first prong of the Strickland test.
But that ruling wasn't the end of it. It was appealed.
Correct. The Court of Special Appeals allowed him to appeal that rejection, which led to the post-conviction hearings being reopened in 2016. And this time, Asia McClain testified in person.
And she stuck to her story.
She reaffirmed her account under oath, that she was with Syed in the library on January 13th, 1999. Her live testimony carried a lot of weight. It showed this wasn't just a piece of paper. It was credible, sworn evidence that could have been used.
And at the same time, the review expanded to include another critical piece of the original case.
The cell phone records. The ones used to place Syed near Leakin Park where the body was buried.
This technical challenge became the second major pillar for getting a new trial.
It did. The defense argued that the cell tower data was unreliable, and Gutierrez should have challenged it much more aggressively. And the key issue, according to the sources, was a specific warning that came with the data from AT&T.
What was the flaw, exactly?
Well, the data was based on pings from cell towers. But AT&T included a clear warning on their records that said outgoing calls could reliably establish location, but incoming calls were not reliable for pinpointing where a phone was.
And the prosecution had used incoming call pings to back up Jay's story about the burial.
Critically, yes. The 2 pings that placed Syed's phone near Leakin Park were from incoming calls.
So if Gutierrez didn't point out that explicit warning from the phone company itself to the jury,
Then that would certainly look like deficient performance under Strickland, and that's exactly what Judge Welch found this time around.
so in June 2016, he reverses his own earlier decision.
He does. He vacates the conviction and grants Syed a new trial, citing ineffective assistance of counsel, specifically because Gutierrez failed to cross-examine the state's expert about the reliability of that cell tower data.
And to make matters worse for the state's original case, their own expert from the trial, a man named Ibrahim Waranowitz.
Yes, he later signed an affidavit himself,
Stating what?
stating that his original testimony about the reliability of those incoming call pings for location tracking was incorrect. He essentially admitted he had made a mistake.
Wow. That's a stunning admission from a key expert witness.
It's an incredible recantation, and it gave powerful momentum to Syed's case. But the state of Maryland wasn't done. They immediately appealed the decision to grant a new trial.
And that kicked off this long, multi-year battle in the appellate courts.
Yes, and one that saw the decision upheld and then dramatically reversed.
So first it goes to the Maryland Court of Special Appeals.
Right, and in March of 2018, that court upholds the new trial. They sided with Judge Welch. But their reasoning focused squarely on the alibi witness.
On Asia McClain.
Yes. They said her testimony could have, and I'm quoting here, raised a reasonable doubt in the mind of at least one juror. They focused on that possibility of doubt, which they felt was enough to meet the prejudice standard.
So they're saying if even one juror might have changed their mind, the trial was unfair. But this is where the legal story takes another huge turn.
It really does. The state appealed again, taking it to Maryland's highest court, the Court of Appeals. And in March 2019, in a very narrow 4-3 decision, they reversed the lower courts.
They denied the new trial and put the conviction back in place.
Reinstated the conviction, yes.
How did they do that? They agreed that Gutierrez's performance was deficient for not looking into that alibi witness, but they still said it didn't warrant a new trial. How do you square that?
They applied that Strickland prejudice test much, much more strictly. The majority opinion argued that there was, quote, not a significant or substantial possibility that the verdict would have been different even if McClain had testified.
Why not? Her testimony directly contradicted the state's timeline.
Their reasoning was that her testimony, at best, only challenged the exact time of the murder. They felt it did nothing to rebut the rest of the state's evidence about Syed's motive and opportunity.
So the story of him being the jilted ex-boyfriend, the narrative from Jay Wilds, that was strong enough in their view to outweigh the timeline discrepancy.
That's essentially their argument, that challenging the when wasn't enough to overcome the who and why that the jury had already accepted.
And what about the cell tower evidence, the part that Judge Welch based his whole decision on?
And this was the other major blow from the High Court. They ruled that Syed had waived his right to appeal on the cell tower issue.
Waived his right.
Procedurally. They said because the specific issue about the AT&T warning wasn't raised in his original 2010 post-conviction petition, he couldn't bring it up now. It was a procedural barrier that effectively shut down that entire line of argument.
So with both the alibi witness and the cell phone evidence arguments rejected by the state's highest court, Syed had only one last option.
The Supreme Court of the United States.
Yeah.
And that option failed very quickly.
In November 2019, they just declined to hear the case.
They rejected his final appeal. And at that point, the Maryland Attorney General made a public statement saying the evidence was overwhelming and that justice for Hae Min Lee had been confirmed. For the second time, it looked like the case was truly over.
And yet, despite the Supreme Court shutting the door, the legal fight continued. It just shifted focus.
It did. It moved on to 2 new tracks, forensic science and prosecutorial accountability. And those 2 paths led to the really stunning events of 2022.
The first step was in March of 2022, when the Baltimore City State's Attorney's Office did something very unusual.
Very. They joined with Syed's defense attorney in a motion requesting new DNA testing.
The prosecution joining the defense, that signals a major change in their own thinking about the case.
It signaled that they had doubts. The request was to test several key pieces of evidence with modern technology. Hae Min Lee's clothing, her shoes, a rape kit.
And the motion pointed out that these specific items had never been tested for DNA before.
Exactly. Some earlier, less advanced testing in 2018 had already shown that Syed's DNA wasn't found on other items. This was a chance to see if a more thorough modern test could identify anyone else's DNA on the evidence most directly related to the crime itself.
And while that forensic investigation was getting underway, the state's attorney's office was also conducting its own internal review of the original case.
An internal review that produced the single most dramatic legal development in the entire saga.
The motion to vacate the conviction filed in September 2022.
And it was filed by the prosecutors themselves, citing Brady violations.
Let's break that down. A Brady violation, named after a Supreme Court case, is a very serious accusation.
It is. It means the prosecution suppressed evidence that was favorable to the defendant, evidence that was material to their guilt or punishment. And the state's attorney's office was now saying unequivocally that they had found this kind of suppressed evidence, and it cast serious doubt on Syed's conviction.
What specifically did they say was withheld?
It all centered on alternate suspects. First, they admitted that the original prosecution failed to turn over evidence about 2 other viable suspects.
Meaning the defense never even knew to investigate them.
Right. And more specifically, they said the prosecution failed to disclose that one of these suspects had actually threatened to kill Hae Min Lee.
A direct threat on her life that the defense never heard about.
A threat from someone who, they now said, had the means, motive, and opportunity to commit the crime.
And the information about these alternate suspects, it gets even more disturbing.
It does. The motion to vacate revealed 2 more highly incriminating details. One, Hae Min Lee's car, which was a critical piece of the crime scene, was found parked right behind the house of one of these alternate suspects.
That's a major detail to leave out.
A huge detail. And second, one of the 2 suspects was later convicted of being a serial rapist after Syed was already in prison.
So, establishing a pattern of violent criminal behavior that the jury, again, never heard about.
Exactly. It provided a powerful context suggesting there were other, very credible suspects that the state had known about and deliberately kept hidden from the defense.
The motion also seemed to back away from the original pillars of the case.
It did. It explicitly questioned the reliability of both the cell phone records and Jay Wilde's testimony, suggesting the current prosecution had lost faith in the very evidence used to convict Syed in the first place. It was a complete repudiation of the original case.
But one piece of evidence cited in that motion created this very public, very ugly dispute between the current prosecutors and the original ones.
The Urich note.
Right. A note written by the original prosecutor, Kevin Urich. The motion quoted a line from it that said, "He told her that he would make her disappear, he would kill her."
And this was presented as proof that an alternate suspect had threatened Hae Min Lee.
But Urich immediately fired back.
He did. He argued that the state's attorney's office was completely misinterpreting his handwritten note. Urich claimed that the he in that sentence was referring to Adnan Syed, not an alternate suspect.
So he's saying it wasn't suppressed evidence about someone else, it was just information they already had about Adnan.
That was his claim. But the state's attorney's office response was pretty sharp. They basically accused him of trying to save face.
And they made another point, didn't they? That even if Urich was right, and the threat was from Adnan,
why wasn't that specific violent threat ever used in either of Syed's trials? They also emphasized that this single note was not the only basis for the Brady violation, that there was other suppressed information from police interviews about these suspects.
So regardless of that back and forth, the cumulative weight of these Brady findings was enough for the court.
Overwhelmingly so. On September 19, 2022, Judge Melissa Finn formally vacated Adnan Syed's conviction.
And he was released from prison that same day after serving 23 years. A month later, prosecutors officially dropped all the charges.
They filed what's called a noli prosequi, which essentially wiped the slate clean. And at that moment, it seemed to be the final chapter.
But this case, which is just defined by reversals, was not over. The actions of 2022 immediately sparked another legal battle, this one focused on victims' rights.
And this phase is so important because it really forces a look at the tension between correcting a potential injustice and the procedural rights that are guaranteed to victims and their families.
The appeal was filed by Hae Min Lee's brother, Young Lee.
Yes. And his appeal wasn't based on the evidence. It wasn't about the Brady violation or the alternate suspects.
It was purely procedural.
Purely procedural. He argued his rights as a victim under Maryland law were violated because he wasn't given enough advance notice of the hearing to vacate the conviction.
He wasn't given a meaningful opportunity to be there in person and to speak.
Exactly. And in March 2023, an appellate court sided with him. In a 2-to-1 decision, They reinstated Adnan Syed's murder conviction.
Which, to many people, just seemed extraordinary. A conviction that was thrown out because of suppressed evidence was now back in place because of a notice defect.
It's a very rare outcome, and it triggered a huge legal debate. The court did acknowledge that the judge let young Lee speak at the hearing over Zoom,
Right.
but the majority ruled that he was owed sufficient advance notice to be able to attend in person, and that failure was a significant violation of his rights.
And the court's criticism wasn't just about the notice to young Lee, was it? They also had issues with how the prosecutors handled the motion itself.
That's right. The appellate court pointed to other procedural flaws. They said the motion to vacate failed to state in detail the reasons for throwing out the conviction, and critically, it didn't identify the two alternate suspects by name in the public filing.
So the lack of transparency in the motion compounded the violation of the victim's rights.
In the court's view, yes.
Yeah.
And this ruling really brings a deep philosophical conflict in the law to the surface.
You had a dissenting judge who argued the appeal should have been considered moot since the charges were already dropped.
Exactly. Judge Stuart Berger's dissent argued that overturning the vacatur based on overwhelming Brady evidence because of a procedural notice issue was just not the right remedy. But the majority decision stood, and this case is now a key reference point for the debate over victims' rights in post-conviction cases.
So after that reinstatement, the legal chess game just went to another level. Syed's team appealed to the Maryland Supreme Court.
They did. And the Supreme Court put a temporary hold on the reinstatement, which allowed Syed to stay free while they considered the case.
And their final decision came much later, in August 2024.
And it was another split decision, 4-3. And it was very complex. On the one hand, they agreed with the lower appellate court that the victim's notice rights were violated in the original vacatur hearing.
So they reinstated the murder conviction again.
They did. The conviction was officially back on the books. But, and this is a huge but, they ordered a complete redo of that vacatur hearing.
To do it over again, but this time follow all the procedural rules correctly.
Precisely, to ensure proper notice was given. And crucially, they ruled that Adnan Syed would remain free while waiting for that new hearing to happen.
So as of late 2024, he's a free man with a reinstated murder conviction, waiting for a hearing that's supposed to decide if that conviction should be thrown out again.
That was the bizarre legal state of affairs. But then the state's attorney, Ivan Bates, made one last decisive strategic move in early 2025.
He announced his office was withdrawing the motion to vacate.
Yes. By pulling back that motion, he avoided the need for that contentious redo hearing entirely. And the conviction, which the Supreme Court had reinstated, just technically stayed on the books.
But if the motion to vacate was withdrawn, how did Adnan Syed stay free? If the conviction was reinstated, shouldn't he have gone back to prison?
And this is the final, very unique legal twist. The state's attorney pivoted to a completely different legal track. He announced he would support a separate motion from Syed's lawyers for a reduced sentence.
Under what authority?
Under Maryland's Juvenile Restoration Act. It's a law designed to give relief to people who were sentenced to long prison terms for crimes they committed as minors.
And Syed was 17 when Hae Min Lee was killed?
So he qualified. This became the final vehicle for his release.
And what was the outcome of that motion?
In March of 2025, Judge Jennifer Schiffer reduced Syed's sentence to time served.
So the end result of all this is what exactly? It's incredibly complex.
It is. The murder conviction technically stands. It was reinstated and never vacated again. But Adnan Syed is permanently free because his sentence was legally reduced to the 23 years he'd already served.
So the system found a resolution, but it wasn't by answering the question of guilt or innocence?
Exactly. They used a totally different mechanism, a restorative justice law for juvenile offenders, to resolve the situation. The legal record is now incredibly ambiguous. You have a man who is free based on a sentence reduction, but whose murder conviction is still technically valid.
This entire legal journey has just become a crucible for so many judicial standards. The right to good counsel, prosecutorial ethics, victims' rights.
It really has. The appellate decisions in 2023 and 2024 especially highlighted this deep tension between correcting what might be a factual injustice and the absolute requirement to follow procedural rules, especially for victims. This case showed that procedure can, in fact, legally trump substantive findings of suppressed evidence.
We followed this case from conviction, through a media explosion, through appeals and reversals, a vacatur based on suppressed evidence, a reinstatement based on procedural defects, and finally, this sentence reduction.
It is a history just defined by legal instability.
Hmm.
It shows that even when evidence shifts dramatically, the legal process itself is this layered, sometimes contradictory system.
So we're left with this highly unusual final outcome. The conviction is reinstated, but the sentence is time served. What does that suggest about the legal system's priorities here? Is it about legal certainty or is it about restorative justice?
That really is the core question, isn't it? The ultimate significance of the conviction standing is that the state got to avoid a messy, high-profile new trial, where they would have had to reprove their case with all this new Brady material out in the open. By using the Juvenile Restoration Act, the court achieved a practical result, Syed's freedom, but it bypassed a definitive ruling on the prosecutorial misconduct or his actual guilt or innocence. It provides an end to the sentence, but it offers a very unclear resolution for the historical record.
And it means the core facts of this tragic case will likely be debated for decades, while Hae Min Lee's family is left without that definitive sense of justice.
Precisely.
Thank you for walking us through that incredibly complex history and breaking down the legal standards so clearly.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening.